Welcome back. This is Today Russia on eNCA. Now, this week, President Cyril Ramaphosa and 5 other leaders from African countries are heading to Russia and Poland. It's all part of the African Peace Initiative regarding the Ukraine war. Participants include President of the Comoros Islands and current AU President, that's Othman Ghazali, President of Egypt, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, President of Senegal, Macky Sall, President of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, Zambian President, Hakainde Hichilema, as well as, of course, our very own President Cyril Ramaphosa. But our senior reporter, eNCA's Aviwe Mtila, is here to unpack all of this, as well as the agenda for this trip. Aviwe, great to have you back. Let's talk about that significance and importance of this mission.
Well, Dumelo, it's very important for the African continent to be united and seen to actively seek peace in the Ukraine and Russian conflict. You understand that a lot of pressure has been put on the African continent to choose one side or the other. So this is a good initiative to sort of shield the African continent itself from being drawn into actually choosing one side or the other. Let's look at the countries, the 6 countries that are going there. They're from different regions in the African continent, and they actually have different stances themselves on the Ukraine and Russian conflict. For example, we understand that Zambia is seen, largely closer to, supporting Ukraine in all of this, more liberal party aligned to the West. Uganda is supporting largely Russia. It seemed to be in that stance. Senegal, although not wanting to be drawn into it seemed, though, to be closer to the West. And you have the 2 economic powerhouses, both in the north and the south, that's Egypt and South Africa. They have a non-aligned stance in this, but actually are being accused of actually being closer to Russia. For example, we saw that issue, for example, in Egypt, not shutting down the airspace for Russian travel. And in South Africa, we have that issue of Lady R, where we are accused of, giving weapons to Russia. So in all of this, trying to pull different African countries to one corner or the other, it's very important for them to be united and go on this mission. In fact, it's a conversation that I had with the Institute of Global Dialogue's Philani Mthembu. Let's take a listen to what he had to say on the importance of this mission.
What African countries are trying to sort of avoid is the continent, is this conflict being another source of division, within the deliberations of the African Union. And that can easily happen because there's been a lot of pressure applied towards African countries to pick a side in this conflict. I mean, Western diplomats have been relentless, in terms of trying to activate their networks on the African continent and trying to sway countries. And I think this initiative certainly is trying to shield the continent from that. So if Africa is seen to be, yes, a player in this, but not a player that exacerbates, the divisions, because the reality is that the continent is the largest grouping within the UN General Assembly. So our votes are coveted right now. So there's a lot of courting of Africa within the UN General Assembly and in other multilateral organizations. And in the absence of a common African position on this conflict, which I would argue this would have been the best way for the continent to actually navigate this geopolitical landscape that's filled with a lot of tension, is to actually forge a common African position.
So what then is the importance of South Africa leading this mission?
Well, it's very important, Tumelo, to see South Africa, being proactive in seeking peace and maintaining its non-alignment stance, especially at the backdrop of all the criticism that South Africa has had towards not being true to that stance and seen leaning towards Russia. We know, of course, the driving force behind this mission itself is President Cyril Ramaphosa leading those heads of states to both Russia and Ukraine. While it was announced, the mission itself, by the president in the recent trip, state visit by the Singapore president. It's been months in planning. So both of these countries, Russia and Ukraine, have been engaged for months in planning, and they've allowed it, which means that they're open to Africa. They don't see Africa as a threat, but very important for South Africa, given that there are BRICS counterparts to Russia. So to even engage Ukraine and have them accommodating South Africa would talk to maintaining that non-alignment stance when it comes to our diplomatic relations. In fact, that non-alignment stance sort of speaks to us being aligned to peace itself and not aligned to any war, and choosing a peaceful resolution to those conditions. In fact, it's something that the president himself, President Cyril Ramaphosa, speaks on quite extensively. Let's take a listen to him.
We are now also witnessing Africa being dragged into conflicts far beyond our own borders. Some countries, including our own, are being threatened with penalties for pursuing an independent foreign policy and for adopting a position of non-alignment. South Africa has not been and will not be drawn into a contest between global powers. We will maintain our position on the peaceful resolution of conflict wherever those conflicts occur.
So now with the BRICS summit coming up in August right here in South Africa, do you think these African heads of states will be able to convince Putin not to come?
Well, you'd expect that those would be part of the deliberations, but some experts suggest, in fact, that the Russians themselves will be doing their own scenario planning. They don't want any embarrassing scenarios when they come to South Africa, although experts believe that he most likely won't be arrested, President Putin, if he is to come to South Africa, but they'd want to avoid any embarrassment that may happen, to their heads of state. So you may see a possibility of the Russian delegation sending someone senior, someone like a prime minister or someone along those ranks in place of President Putin himself. Some of the conversations, in fact, Dumela, that I've been having quite extensively with some of the analysts. Let's take a listen once more to Pilani Mthembu on this current issue.
Can either, have President Putin here, but basically ignore the arrest warrant. Because, I don't think it's realistic to think that South Africa would arrest a president of a nuclear state, such as Russia. It's not really realistic. In legal terms, yes, that might be the obligation, but in reality, I doubt that that would happen. The other option is what you are saying, is sort of, persuading President Putin to not necessarily come, yes, to be invited, but for whatever reasons, because he's commanding the special military operation and the Ukrainian counteroffensive, or whatever reasons that are found, that President Putin skips, this particular summit. But I do think anyway, skipping it will diminish the weight of this particular summit, because it's the first one since the pandemic that is taking place physically. And I think it would have provided an opportunity to take some of the concerns from all of the BRICS countries towards Russia in terms of what impact this conflict is having as you continue to prolong it. So, it's really a tough one, but I think it will be both South Africa maybe trying to convince, but on the other side, Russia probably assessing and saying maybe it is in our interest.
And I think we heard that earlier clip from President Cyril Ramaphosa saying there are almost threats of penalties should South Africa not act in a particular way. But are we as a country likely to face any consequences, from the ICC should Putin come into South Africa?
Well, South Africa is a signatory of the Rome Statute, and you'd expect that it will upset a lot of those 125 odd countries that are also signatories of that very Rome Statute. But also not just abroad. You can expect a lot of backlash, whether it be political parties like the Democratic Alliance here, also civil society organizations here back home. But there are the fears, of course, of the economic, consequences. We've seen the RAND tank just on that allegation from the U.S. ambassador of Lady R being pumped with weapons from South Africa going to Russia, for example. So the experts are suggesting that while that may be short-term, they don't see it being a long-term consequence with the economic consequences. For example, we do a lot of trading with US, the European countries, but they suggest that they have a lot of money in the country for them to prolong any economic consequences. In fact, let's take a listen now to Professor Zondi, international relations expert.
If South Africa decides to go on with this and not arrest Putin when it comes to South Africa, the first consequence is that it will damage South Africa's standing in relation to the rule of law, especially in the eyes of South Africans themselves, because then they would have violated the South African law. The second thing is that it will damage its standing as a member of the ICC. And therefore, before the 125 members of the ICC, South Africa would have acted incorrectly. I hear that it might also damage its relations with those who are not members of the ICC, like the United States, they are not members of the ICC. The United States has also said that it will never allow any US citizen to be charged by the ICC. So it can decide to do its game, not on the basis of principle, but because it's swaying its power and can undermine South Africa's economic relations. But the real danger is with the South African public and with the membership of the ICC. And everybody else are hypocrites that can also seek to damage it, but for reasons that have nothing to do with international law or with fairness internationally, but because they have power.
Well, thank you so much for bringing us this story. eNCA senior reporter Aviwe Mtila on African heads of states planning to travel to Russia and Poland. This all as part of a peacekeeping mission to, of course, a country, Russia, that is embroiled with conflict with Ukraine.